Hashem Yirachem.
You've got to be the only Aussie who's pretty much basically missing the English accent.
I'm missing English accent.
They were pretty happy when
Excellent.
they took us out.
I must say it was a pleasure to meet you today. The pleasure is now even greater than it was 5 minutes ago.
Like I can do your accent?
Excuse me?
Can I pretend like I can do your accent?
Most of us can't tell the difference, I'll be honest.
But
I can normally.
thank you, Binyamin, right? No, what's his name? Yitzhak. Oh, Yitzhak, I'm so
In
sorry.
New York, I would never make fun of someone's accent, but I feel like Israel gives you and this.
Yitzhak. Okay, people, I'm going to start. What I'd like to do today is we're going to talk about the topic of Kavod HaTorah, how appropriate to speak about it the week after Shavuot. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about the respect that we are required, the halachot of respect towards the Sefer Torah. When are we required to stand up for a Sefer Torah? When can we sit down in front of a Sefer Torah? Then we're going to talk from the holiness of a Sefer Torah to talk about a library of holy books. What is our responsibility towards holy books? When I have a pile of holy books, what order should the books be on? Can I use one holy book and lean another holy book on that book? And then after speaking about the Sefer Torah and holy books, the second part we're going to talk about is how are we allowed ever to erase God's name when a holy book or a Sefer Torah is old and it's no longer functional? You obviously don't throw it away. And what treatment do we do with?
I was reading about this in Mishnah Torah. I have a Mishnah Torah from Rusa.
Excellent.
And Rambam actually gives a list. It's actually quite well. It's actually with the paragraph that the Rambam hasn't laid out. It's actually quite comprehensive.
Yes. Yes. We actually part of the Rambam is in our source sheet here.
Through a college or Jews college?
Now we get a rough experience.
I have been to Jews College. Yes.
How was that?
Lovely.
Jonathan Saxman.
Absolutely, but perhaps we'll talk about that afterwards.
Okay.
Although it is excellent, and I do remember your name is Yitzhak, so that is that. At least that is good.
Rob Listeman, I'm making fun of your accent. I just think it's
Okay.
Really cool accent.
Rob Listeman makes fun of your accent.
That is true. Okay, sweet people. What I'd like to do now is I want to start with let me just tell you something. On Shavuot, at the end of Shavuot, our family were all sitting down together and we were singing Shavuot songs. And we have a daughter, a very holy daughter, called Tehillah.
She has a British accent as well.
Absolutely. And she said something amazing. I want to tell you.
Is this your guys?
No.
This is the one that's very.
England, it'll be like a safari walk for you.
And this is what she said. Listen here, people. This is unbelievable. So if any of you have ever been to a wedding before, when you go to a wedding, it is very obvious to all who the bride is. You can spot the bride. Because the bride, dressed in white, normally quite easy to spot at most weddings. But when it comes to the groom, when it comes to the Chatan in many weddings is harder to tell which one of the guys is the Chatan. You have to look for a minute, see who's dancing around him. Kala, straight away. The Chatan, harder to spot.
Just look for the woman with the thing over her face. And you
There's
know
a
who the bride
solution
is.
to this problem.
No, the bride you're doing fine. But how do you know the groom is? And this is what Tehillah said. Beautiful. She said at the end of the wedding, the groom, the bride, will put her hand like this, and there'll be one guy that will walk out of the hall with the bride. The guy that leaves with the bride, that guy is obviously the groom. The groom. He is the groom. You hear that? Sweet, wonderful people. On Shavuot, on the festival of Shavuot, was the marriage between Am Yisrael, the Jewish people, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The marriage between us and Torah. If the Torah is the bride, how do we know if this was a marriage? We know if it was a marriage between us and Torah is if after Shavuot, we walk away with the Torah. If we walk away with the Torah, so then you know we did Shavuot. Then we know that we were the groom. So I want to bless us all over the next coming few weeks. We should walk away with the Torah. And when we walk away with the Torah, then we know we were the groom on Shavuot. Okay. Oh, just beautiful. Okay. Good. But then that's an instruction because we're talking about the respect that we need to show to Torah. As I'm sure you all know, when a Sefer Torah is around in a room, the custom is to stand. I want to start, well, they're really, if you have a look, there are 4 topics we're going to talk about. The first one is respect for Sefer Torah. The second one is respect for holy books. The third one is erasing God's name. You know, when you're allowed to erase God's name. And then the fourth topic is, what do we do with used holy books? How do you dispose of used holy books? That's topic number 4. But the first topic is Kavod Sefer Torah. How do we... Oh, 4 and 5 on the sheet is one topic.
I see.
What's the source? How do we know? We all know this instinctively. So every once in a while, you're learning upstairs in the Beit Midrash, and somebody takes a Sefer Torah, immediately everybody stands up. How do we know? What's the source for the idea of standing up when a Sefer Torah is on the move? Do you know the source? You'll be blown away.
I think we find it in this week's parasha that when the cabinet of Israel is like when they were in Aman was
very, very, very good.
This is also because this is why we sing this pasuk.
Nachon, Vayi bin Soah ha'aron vayomer Moshe, Kuma Hashem vayifutz oivecha. You're right, that's excellent. That's very, very good. But that is... Yes. Yitzchak. Yeah, what does it say? Thank you. What does it say?
What? I think it says. I can't remember.
Maybe it says Rabbi Yossi Omer Kol Mekabed Torah Gofo Mekabed Ed Al Briot V'Kol Mechalel Et Torah Gufo Mechalel Al Briot. Maybe that's what it says.
Excellent. Very, very good. Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
It also says in Vayikra, very good.
Okay, so have a look over here. Excellent. Thank you very, very much. Exactly. So the truth is, it's very, very important idea. First of all, the idea of Kavod HaTorah, respect for Torah. Kol ha'mechabed et HaTorah gufa mechubad, as you see. V'chol ha'mechalel gufo mechulal al habriot. The concept of Kavod HaTorah makes Talmud Torah study or relationship with Torah different to our relationship with anything else. In all other areas of human life, so sort of maths, archaeology, science, you can study these, but we don't have the same concept of showing respect towards the topic as we have a requirement of showing respect to Torah. And that's what makes Torah more than just an intellectual experience. It's about connecting to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The basis for standing for a Sefer Torah. It's interesting. Your idea is so interesting, David. Vayi bin Soah ha'aron, Kuma Hashem. But there we're asked, Hashem is getting up. When the Jewish people traveled, Vayi bin Soah ha'aron, when they had the Kuma Hashem vayafutz oivecha, we're asking Hashem to get rid of all the enemies that might trouble us on our ways. But an idea of standing up purely out of respect, not because I'm traveling, but getting up for respect. The only time in the Torah where you see a requirement to stand up for respect is source number 2, Mipnei Sevatakum. Mipnei Sevatakum, parenthetically, this verse, Mipnei Sevatakum, is a pasuk that we see on buses. Have you ever seen that on a bus in Israel? Sometimes...
You should stand for the elderly.
Exactly. Isn't that amazing? Because in English, in England, or perhaps elsewhere, they'll just have a sign at the front of the bus saying, if there's somebody who needs a seat, please get up. But in Israel, they use a pasuk with which to articulate that sentiment, which I find
It only works in Hebrew, though.
inspiring. Yeah, because we are Olam HaTanakh. Okay, Mipnei Sevatakum. Stand up in respect for an elderly. V'hadarta pnei zaken, and show respect for those who are older. V'yotem Elokecha, have faith, fear of God, Ani Hashem. You hear that? So we have to stand up for certain people, and we stand up for them out of pure respect. On that, the Gemara in Kiddushin tells us, Ma'u la'amod lifnei Sefer Torah, why stand up for a Sefer Torah? Rabbi Chilkiah v'Rabbi Simon v'Rabbi Elazar Amrei, Kal v'chomer. Mipnei lomdei omdim mipanei lokol shekain. If we have a mitzvah, as we know, to stand up for a Torah scholar, somebody who has studied Torah, we learn this in Rambam Hilchot Talmud Torah, that you stand up out of respect for a Torah scholar. If you're standing up for somebody who studies Torah, then you obviously need to stand up for the Torah itself.
Obviously, a Kavod.
Because
There's many nafkaminas, and there could be, Talmud Chacham could be, one is not a breathing living object.
correct.
Can't decipher the halachic or other fine dexterous points of a document. And others is just a document itself. So, Kavod, I think there would be sort of the opposite, potentially. Does the Gemara talk about that or not really?
No. But your question, the truth is, a Sefer Torah.
You're going to basis. Why Sefer Torah?
Yeah, so the Sefer Torah is a very, very interesting idea. I'll say, yeah.
So I have a question. I hope you know what this is. We're familiar with this book. I'm sure most of us are. We have from Torah. This is the Torah. The words in here are the same words that are in a Sefer Torah. As you can see, I'm holding this book up, but everyone has remained seated.
Perfect. That's my Kavod. You should do that.
Ah,
This
excellent.
has more.
But the fact
So-
It's Targum and
In this case, Moshe,
And
is this not the works of the works of the Torah? Because this isn't. You couldn't take this out of the Aron HaKodesh and use it for the reading of the Torah.
no, you can't. But this has
So this is more
this
like
has
a
the
work
Torah
of the work.
plus more.
Okay, your points are absolutely excellent. Excellent
A
points.
tiny bit of nice writing, and it's on another stuff of some sort. I can't remember, like sheepskin or whatever. I forget.
It's supposed to be.
Does that make
On
it more
parchment,
kosher?
absolutely. Let me explain. Let me explain. I think that a Sefer Torah is not just the written text on parchment. There is a view that once you complete a Sefer Torah, so for example, if you have a Sefer Torah, right, a Sefer Torah, but there's one word, like you haven't written the last word of that Sefer Torah. If you haven't completed that last word, and it were to fall on the ground, that's fine. If that were to come into the room, there'd be no requirement for you to stand up. It's only when the text is completed. I'll just tell you two further ideas. There is a couple of halachot. There are a couple of halachot pertaining to a Sefer Torah that give a Sefer Torah more than just the value of a written text. Two things. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a Hachnasat Sefer Torah, when a new Sefer Torah is written and brought into a Bet Knesset. One of the most moving moments at a Hachnasat Sefer Torah for me is what?
My WhatsApp profile picture.
Really, that's amazing.
Yeah. Why did you? And what other circumstance would I, a proud Ashki, be holding a Sephardic Torah?
Moshe, you are such an inspiring person, and you just became even more inspiring.
Just came right.
Excellent.
Right,
So,
right,
So if you ever go to a Hachnasat Sefer Torah, for me, one of the most moving moments of a Hachnasat Sefer Torah is you write the Sefer Torah in the house of a scribe or the donor, whoever it is, and then this by completing the last word, that last bit of ink, you have this piece of parchment turns into a Sefer Torah, and all the holiness we discuss kicks in. You then dance this Sefer Torah down the street to the Bet Knesset. When you arrive in the Bet Knesset, the custom is you open the Aron HaKodesh, and the Sifrei Torah inside the Aron HaKodesh are brought out into the street in order to welcome the new Sefer Torah. What do you mean to welcome a new? I mean, it's almost attributing, not human, but sort of attributing sort of aspects to this Sefer Torah that is beyond just a text. And that therefore is not saying that a word is like a person, but a Sefer Torah is more than just a document. It's more than just a document. It seems to have this sort of
you'd
be onto it.
You'd be inferring from orthopractice or minhag, to be generous minhag, that there is a halachic and textual basis for, I mean, based on your argument, based on what you just said, for the reason why a Sefer Torah is deserving of such cover. There must be, to support what you're saying, presumably, a source in the Gemara or the Chumash or the Tanakh or
That is it. This is the source here in Kiddushin. This Kal Vachomer.
But I think our point is it comes from amateur, but worth further investigation, because it's like, I mean, maybe the Amoraim and Tanaim talk about it, but like, that's a valid point. Why is it that the ink and the parchment, and I don't even know if you say bracha on it, maybe you say bracha on it, how does that, maybe it's in the Zohar Kodesh, maybe that transforms the document into something better, but from the sources we have on paper here, you would not seemingly have the empirical evidence based on the classical sources that the Sefer Torah deserved us to stand. So the question is, why do we stand then?
There's a Kal Vachomer here. The Kal Vachomer.
The Kal Vachomer is not sufficient.
Why?
No, why is it? But the
or is that just how the Gemara passes?
Yeah, this is. I mean, it's not a Kal Vachomer that we're stating now.
Right.
This is a Kal Vachomer that was given at the time of the Gemara.
So you're saying the Gemara subsequently paskins that because of the Kal Vachomer, which to us doesn't seem entirely logical, it does not.
Yeah, obviously. I mean, sort of. They are aware, these rabbis, that a Sefer Torah is parchment and ink, and yet, I mean, they were aware. The question that you're asking is, if I have to show, I mean, obviously there's a difference between a human being and a bit of parchment and ink, right?
Yeah.
But they're saying no, that this Kal Vachomer works. Why? Because a Sefer Torah is more than just the ingredients. You follow? I'll give you another example.
I'm not saying that, but we can say the Gemara is.
I'll give you another example. If let's say an Apikoros wrote a Sefer Torah, somebody who doesn't believe in God wrote a Sefer Torah. Now it's not brought here, but if an Apikoros wrote a Sefer Torah, that Sefer Torah would have no holiness. Everything that we're discussing now is only relevant for a Sefer Torah written by somebody who believes in God. Therefore, I would think that it's not just the ink and the parchment that give this holiness, because if that were to be the case, then two people could write identical books, and one would expect both of them to have the same level of holiness. But since we know that not to be the case, if it was written by somebody with incorrect intentions, that would not imbue that text with any holiness. That indicates that there must be a factor in a Sefer Torah that is beyond the raw materials.
More sufficient to say there's Rishonim who say that you have to bring down that it's specifically that type of document that is holy and worthy of standing, rather than what you're potentially. It just seems like there have to be further sources to identify what you're saying.
I think I can help.
Okay.
Maybe you can help. When Hashem tells them to build a Mishkan,
Yeah.
and eventually what happens, they end up building all the pieces, and each piece inherently doesn't really have holiness, you would say, but they had an ark, they had all these things, and all of a sudden, and when everything was completed, they brought it together, and they have the festivities, they have all the things, and all of a sudden the fire comes down and accepts it, and then all of a sudden you have the pillar of fire that stands in the Olmoed, and Hashem talks to the ark, right? So in and of itself, when they built it, when they made it, it wasn't anything, and then it became holy, and Hashem put His presence, into the thing.
If the Gemara said that and then made a tie,
I'm saying here's
Torah.
a proof from the Torah for you to why it makes sense that if you have ink and parchment, you put it together, then all of a sudden Hashem accepts this and gives it kedusha.
That's
They're
what she
simply
goes
just
by.
saying it. Huh?
Yeah.
That help? Hopefully.
Yeah, no. It's just, I'm going, and I don't know if it's helpful, but I'm going by a strict halachic evolution of how that might develop, the standing, and it doesn't seem to be the chorus in this sheet or what you're saying, and potentially we're taking license with what you're saying as to how that would have developed.
Oh, this one's simpler.
Well, what your question is? You're right. You want to know how how the holiness of a Sefer Torah, well, what's the source for the holiness of a Sefer Torah?
And the source of subsequent standing. That would seem to be the correct methodology for answering our question as to why we stand and we give great Kavod to the Torah, Sefer Torah.
So I think
would
that
certainly be necessary.
I think that a Kal Vachomer from the Amoraim is a very, very strong. I mean, it's a very, very strong source to a halachic basis for something, which is what we have over here. Does that make sense to you?
Is there any basis to dispute a Kal Vachomer, the Amorim and the Tanai?
Not
Obviously,
really.
We can't do that, but like it'd be like the Kal Vachomer doesn't seem logical. But we say that the Gemara Paskins like that anyway, and we accept how the Gemara Paskins.
So if there's a Kal Vachomer that doesn't make sense,
Yeah.
there are really two approaches to the Kal Vachomer. If we see a Kal Vachomer presented in the Gemara and is subsequently challenged by other Amoraim, so then you could question the validity of that Kal Vachomer. But if there's a Kal Vachomer that appears in the Talmud that is not challenged, so then our approach would be, let me understand that Kal Vachomer better, rather than, I wouldn't say, find me an alternative proof, but it would be more, I'd like to understand, assuming that this was an unchallenged statement, so it means this was accepted by the Amoraim, and then later when the Talmud was edited, there was no questions put on this Kal Vachomer. So then the approach would then be to look at the Rishonim and to understand the basis of the Kal Vachomer. But I don't think there would be a necessity to find an alternative to the Kal Vachomer. You follow? No, so I'm saying that the source is a good source. You may have a question in understanding that source, and therefore there's certainly value in looking at the Rishonim on that source. But of course, but I'm not sure that it would be appropriate. I'm not sure that I would look for an alternative source. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. That there were there were Rishonim on the specific.
So you can question. They could.
Rishonim would elucidate as to why this is Kal Vachomer.
Correct. Exactly. Correct.
Explain further as to the meaning of this and provide, even if we're lucky, halacha as to why people stand for the Sefer.
So I'm not sure halacha. I'm not sure they would talk about. There are other halachot that would. Yeah.
So when there is view in Talmud that is not challenged, it becomes pshat.
If there's a statement in the Talmud, well, it depends if it's a halachic statement or
yes,
not.
Yes, halachic statement. This one.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, if there's a halachic statement that's made in the Gemara that is not challenged, that is most likely that it will be halacha. Yeah.
Does it come from Mishnah as well, or just Gemara?
So certainly, it's more likely in Mishnah than in Gemara. I mean, if there's an unchallenged, we have in general there is a concept in halacha of a stam mishnah. A stam mishnah is a mishnah that just makes a statement but doesn't state different opinions. So when you have a stam mishnah, the halacha is normally like the stam mishnah. Oh, Yossi, how are you doing?
Very good, you?
Wonderful. Yes.
Got a question. I'm going to try and tie it into as much source as you've given us here, plus what I know. Is that talking about how the Torah is not complete until the very final word is, or letter is placed within it, and it's not holy even until doing so. And when you've also got, say, for example, in kashrus, you see this in many cases, whether it's in a factory or when it's in a large kitchen, that the work is delegated, and as long as a Jew was involved in the process, either in the completion or the start of it, then the food is kosher. Could this be the same with the Torah? And if not, why? For example, could a full scroll of Torah be produced by a machine and say completed by a Jew, or even
no,
and started by a Jew,
no,
whatever method, and it's kosher?
No, excellent question. It's a very creative question. And it's also very exciting when you bring different halachic areas together. You spoke about, let's say, in kashrut, like you said correctly, there is an issue, a problem of bishul akum, if something is cooked by a non-Jew. Now, if something is cooked by a non-Jew, bishul akum, that's not a forbidden d'oraita. It's a takana de rabbanan. It's something that was established by the rabbis for various reasons, to say that you shouldn't, we don't eat food that is cooked by a non-Jew. Then the rabbis had a discussion to define what's cooked. What aspect of the preparation would be the cooking. And they then defined that if a Jew was involved in the cooking process, for example, turning on the oven, because the oven is, or turning on the gas, whatever it is, so then we wouldn't consider this to be cooking done by a non-Jew, we consider it cooking done by a Jew. But all we're doing there is we're trying to define what food you're allowed to eat and what food you're not allowed to eat, and we're trying to be as accommodating as possible in defining as broadly as possible what could be considered Jewish cooking.
So if Goy makes food, I cannot eat it?
No. Oh, this is going off topic. No. It's a bit more complicated than that. There's certain foods. Generally, that's something else. Generally, fancier foods, like food that would be served in a banquet. Yeah.
Meat.
So, Rob, hang on, sorry. Just a rebuttal to what you were saying is that
We have only said half. But this is a different. This is a different principle over here.
okay.
Yeah, go on. But what were you going to say?
Well, in rebuttal is that in the process of cooking is that we can't define exactly what's cooking because we don't know at what point you would fully consider it cooked or completed. So as long as the Jew had a process in the hand of cooking,
Correct.
he would be considered as if the food was cooked by a Jew.
Or
in this case, with
that
the
is
Torah,
not bishul akum.
right. In this case, with the Torah, we know that there's nothing complete about it until it's fully finished.
Correct.
In which case, you could say that as long as a sofer writes the very last letter, that Torah has been completed.
No. It doesn't work like that, because here every single letter has to be written by a sofer. It's a different process. It's a different calculation. It's not.
What about the Gills?
Same. This isn't. All the same. I mean, there are different halachot, slightly different halachot, in writing a Sefer Torah on the one hand and writing tefillin and mezuzot on the other hand, in terms of writing things in order, not writing things in order. Tefillin and mezuzot are obviously much shorter, and therefore they've got different requirements. But there needs to be intent for every aspect of writing of a Sefer Torah, tefillin, or mezuzah, and that's
machine with the intent.
It doesn't work.
I gave the machine a bris.
No. It doesn't work. It doesn't work for a Sefer Torah. Okay, sweet people.
What? Wait. Question.
You say that
What if I attach electrodes? What if I attach electrodes to the hand of the
Still.
Still. But the sofer is doing.
No. Writing a Sefer Torah needs intention for writing a Sefer Torah. In fact, some people have a custom.
And the sofer had intent while attaching the electrodes to his hand.
No, some people have a custom. Whenever you write God's name in a Sefer Torah, do you know what you have to do? Before you write God's name, right, exactly. So therefore, intent is all about intent.
They write a couple of the sheet. I can't remember what they're called. The section, the sheets of the Torah. What are they called? I can't remember. No. No, it's a physical sheet that's sewn together. They're sewn together.
Right. Yes.
They fill out a number of them.
Yeah.
Hashem's name, and then one day they go to the mikvah,
correct.
And then they
right.
They're writing Hashem's name.
Right.
As I understand.
Correct. I mean, some people do it like that, but I just want to go back to our discussion, and we've seen.
I already accepted it was a Kavod, don't worry.
Excellent. But I think that there is a discussion there is a discussion about Sifrei Torah and the way we treat Sifrei Torah. This over here is talking about standing up for a Sefer Torah, but there are discussions about Sifrei Torah in many different places in Shas. This over here was I don't know what the word, like a zoom in on one aspect, and that is standing up for a Sefer Torah. But I wonder this might even answer Yitzhak's question. If you understood the discussion of writing a Sefer Torah, or the discussion of a Sefer Torah appears in many different places in Shas. There's a big sugya about writing a Sefer Torah in Masechet Menachot. There's this discussion over here in Kiddushin about standing up for a Sefer Torah, and there are other places in Shas that talk about a Sefer Torah. When you take all of these different parts and you put them together, that's where you get the full picture of how we understand the Sefer Torah. So I imagine that on understanding this Kal Vachomer over here, they'll draw from it's their sources from all over Shas in order to discuss this. But there are many times as well where there is sort of a parallel between a person, like a Talmid Chacham, someone who studies Torah, and the book itself, a Sefer Torah. There's also a Gemara, but I forget, but I'm going to say it's maybe might be in Kiddushin as well, about a house that's burning. Do you know about this? If a house is burning, and there are two things in the house. One of them is a corpse, and the other one is a Sefer Torah.
You save the Sefer Torah?
And you can rescue one.
Save the corpse.
Corpse or Sefer Torah, you save the corpse. Correct. Why? Because the corpse is created b'tzelem Elokim. The corpse is creating God's image. But that I imagine that you would need to study all these different aspects.
Well, I imagine it's not, even if you did, it wouldn't be appropriate to come out with the conclusion necessarily. I mean, you'd have to rely on Gedolei Ador for that.
On what topic?
For the Shuf Sefer Torah.
Yeah. So what were you saying?
Well, I was saying if you happen to be very creative and you have time, and you go in Sefaria and in Sefer Torah in the Shas, then and you read all the sources of the Sefer Torah in Shas, still not really appropriate to come out with the distinction. It's really Gedolei Ador or people who have been studying for 10 years.
It's in halacha. I mean, there are halachot.
Or the Messiah,
Yeah. So, for example, okay, excellent. So we had a Kavod Chomer that we saw in Kiddushin. The Kavod Chomer said like this: since you have a mitzvah of standing up for Lomdei Torah, Befaneha, meaning Lomdei Torah, you stand up for. Befaneha, in front of the Torah itself, how much more so? On a basis of that Kavod Chomer in Kiddushin, which has led to a fascinating discussion, we then come to halacha. Halacha in the Bet Yosef. Bet Yosef rules like this. And the truth is, we'll look at a number of, the siman is Reish Pei Bet, and we'll look both in Bet Yosef and also in the Shulchan Aruch, and on some of the commentaries as well, on the Shulchan Aruch, on this siman, which is the siman that talks about the holiness of a Sefer Torah. And Seif Bet reads like this. On Seif Bet. Haro'eh oto keshuhu ma'alech. If you see a Sefer Torah on the move, chayav la'amod lefanav. You're required to stand up. Ad sheyit kasem me'enehem, until you can no longer see it anymore. So the mitzvah of standing up for a Sefer Torah is standing up for a Sefer Torah on the move. Now, why is this important? I'll tell you why it's important. Because sometimes people make a mistake.
That's Torah that when the Torah is out and everything and all, they don't try to put all their energy into standing and everything and all. They sometimes sit. And Yom Kippur, when the ark's open, they try to put out their whole entire energy by standing, even though that's not the halacha.
That was excellent. Esther, you put that so well. Exactly. There is also this impulse when the ark is open, you should stand up, right? However, the requirement to stand is not when the ark. I mean, we do stand up when the ark is open, but it is more important to stand when there is a Sefer Torah on the move. And therefore, Simchat Torah, when the Sefer Torah is on the move, it is more important to be standing than at other times, let's say Ne'ilah, when the Aron HaKodesh is open. And yet there are people that would not dream of sitting down when the Aron HaKodesh is open for Ne'ilah, but perhaps would sit down on Simchat Torah. However, the Bet Yosef over here would seem to indicate that the opposite would be the appropriate thing to do.
Why, if I may, when it says Hamadrugot Osin, the Bnei Aaron Kodesh, why is it that specific area does not require standing? Why does the Torah suddenly not require standing when it's on the when it's coming up on the bimah or up onto or where it's on the stairs where it's about to go? Why does that change?
Where are you reading from?
Sorry, the Shulchan Aruch Yerodea, Halachas Sefer Torah, Siman, Pesh Pei.
Where are you? No, that's talking about something else. This is the next bit. What we've just discussed is a Sefer Torah. We just discussed the laws pertaining to a Sefer Torah, and we've said that when there is a Sefer Torah on the move, we are required to stand up for the Sefer Torah. Why are we required to stand up for us when Sefer Torah is on the move? Based on the pasuk Mipnei Sevatakum v'Hadata Pnei Zaken, that we are required to stand up for the knowledge that Zaken is somebody who is learned in Torah. We have to show them respect. Rambam writes it also in Hilchot Talmud Torah. We have a requirement to stand up out of respect for Talmidei Chachamim. That is
for any Rav who we're learning a shiur from.
So in terms of standing up for Talmidei Chachamim, the Rambam talks about that, but that's not our topic.
Where?
In Hilchot Talmud Torah. In Hilchot Talmud Torah, there are different types of rabbis. You have a teacher and your teacher. In general, you're required to stand up for any teacher, but if it's your teacher, if it's any teacher, you're required to stand up.
Which sefer of Mishnah Torah?
Talmud Torah. Hilchot Talmud Torah. But this is not our topic for today. Oh, Mada, the first one.
Yes.
Okay. Now, sweet, wonderful people, with that we conclude our discussion of a Sefer Torah. We are saying that you stand up out of respect for a Sefer Torah.
Which chapter and paragraph?
Oh, we're not going to look into that now. But it's the laws of stand.
Yeah, it's a halfway given the
But that's standing up. That's standing up for a Talmid Chacham. But we're talking about standing up for Sefer Torah. Okay.
Or Talmid Chacham. Yeah.
Correct. We are required to stand up for Talmid Chachamim. Okay. Now, after we finish discussing the respect that we need to show for Sefer Torah, we're going to move on to showing respect to holy books. Holy books. This is really based on the respect that we need to show for a Sefer Torah.
Okay.
Try not to go.
Okay. So, in terms of the respect for holy books, we see this is now in Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch, Hilchot Sefer Torah, writes, Asur le'shev al mita shesefer Torah aleha. You are not allowed to sit at the same level as a Sefer Torah. So if there's a Sefer Torah on a bench, you're not allowed to sit on that bench because there's a Sefer Torah there already. V'chol sheken, this is now the Ramah. V'chol sheken she'asur lahanicha al gabi karka. You're certainly not allowed to put a Sefer Torah on the floor. V'hu hadin shar Sefarim. Now that's a very important statement there. Everything that we just said concerning a Sefer Torah, you're not allowed to sit at the same level as Sefer Torah. You're not allowed to put a Sefer Torah on the floor. Hu hadin shar Sefarim. So too for all other holy books. And then he says, not just on the floor, afilu on madrigot she'osim b'fnei Aron HaKodesh. Meaning you might have thought the floor means the floor. But let's say you have a floor, and then you have stairs leading up to the Aron HaKodesh. The stairs leading up to the Aron HaKodesh have got the same din as the floor, and therefore asur lahaniach Sefarim v'lo yaniach adam sefer Torah al breichav. You shouldn't lean it on your knees. That's also not respect. That's not an appropriate thing to do. And says the Yerodeh, likewise you shouldn't treat any holy book that way. Meaning, when you read a holy book, you shouldn't be leaning on your knees and reading the book. There's a certain respect that you should be showing towards the books. The Shulchan Aruch starts by giving all these laws pertaining to a Sefer Torah, and then extends, and so too, all of these requirements are true, not just for a Sefer Torah, they are also true for all holy books. Joy, joy, joy. Is that clear? Okay, so we've now made a jump. We started with the Sefer Torah, and we've now moved to holy books, a requirement to show respect to holy books. Right? Now, let's continue. The next seif over here talks about when you have a pile of books. When you have a pile of books, how can the pile be? If you have a look here, are there any piles of books here?
I'm glad that we're at this point because I went to someone who hosted me and a bunch of other people for Shabbos, and a question came up. She had a Tehillas Hashem, and her fiance had
Mazel tov.
a regular book, regular Safard Siddur. And she posed the question, since Tehillas Hashem doesn't have the God's name written in it fully anyway, it's all in abbreviations in a way. Does that mean that there's a specific order that how one should be placed beneath it when stacked?
No. So the truth is, we can read it inside, but I'll summarize very quickly. Really, the thing that Torah is always the top of the pile. It's always Torah is number one. Number two is Nevi'im or Ketuvim, and then after that, any other book. So you would never have a pile of Sidurim that have got any order. It's always, in any pile, the top of the pile is Torah, Chamisha Chumshei Torah, Bereshit Shemot, Vayikra Bamidbar Dvarim, Chamisha Chumshei Torah. After that, you would have Nevi'im and Ketuvim, either Nevi'im or Ketuvim. So let's say you have a Sefer Tehillim, which is Ketuvim, that could be above Yoshua, which is Nevi'im. But neither of them would be above a Bereshit because that's Torah. You follow? And then after that, so you don't have Mishnah above Gemara. You don't have a Gemara above a Rambam. You wouldn't have this Siddur above that Siddur. The only three things are Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and every other Jewish book.
Does that count to having to be like a whole book of?
Excellent.
Or is it? Does partials also count? If you have like a little bit of Chumash on, like, say, a nearly complete stack of papers, and then a little bit of Tanakh on another, and so on, or does it always have
Not
to
sure
be
I understood. What have you got here?
So, say, for example, in one case, I've got half a Chumash because somehow it's been torn in half, and I've got a complete Tanakh, and I've got a stack of papers that have all sources quoting, say, part of the Chumash. Is there an order?
That's a good question.
Think of the stack like as if it's been like held together, binded by something.
That is an excellent question. In general, a book is holier than a sheet. Even if the sheet has got Torah on it, a book, because a Torah book is made for multiple use. A piece of paper is made for single use, and therefore.
The whole book is the one I said, Tanakh, and half a book is the Chumash.
Oh, and then the Chumash. Well, no, it's not. If it has Chumash in it.
There's a difference between a Tanakh and just a Chumash.
Yes.
Or they're both considered Torah.
Yeah, I don't think if you had a Tanakh and a Chumash. That's a good question. Would you put? I'm not sure that would make a difference. If you have a Tanakh, would the Chumash be above the Tanakh?
Would the fact that it does Nevi'im and Ketuvim and it elevate it, like bring it down, or would it just be irrelevant?
That's a good question. Good question. I don't think it makes a difference. I think that you could have a Chumash above a Tanakh. If it's probably a Chumash, if it was a complete Chumash, that would probably be above a Tanakh.
Well, the fact that it does Nevi'im and Ketuvim brings it down, actually.
Yeah, because it means you have a Chumash underneath Nevi'im Ketuvim. You follow?
Yeah, right.
If you have,
okay,
Right,
Yeah. yeah, that's it. Would be good for every other
Inside
aspect.
the book, the Torah is on top of the Nevi'im.
Machon.
Yeah, correct.
okay.
But then underneath the Nevi'im Ketuvim would be a Chumash.
Right, yeah.
So how do you stack two Tanakhs?
No, no, but that doesn't matter. That
Just
doesn't
put them on
matter.
a shelf at that point.
Yeah,
like,
just put them on the
let's
shelf.
say two identical books. It becomes like
No, because
they have
you just
they have
said
the same value somehow.
the point about in a Tanakh is already inside of it is stacked Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. But then if you put a Tanakh and then another Tanakh, you have
So,
Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah,
Perhaps the
Nevi'im,
fact
Ketuvim.
Yeah, I don't think
Yeah,
that
but-
matters.
but-
That's
but
not a
this is
problem.
That's why it's a sword for
complete book. It's like it's completed. It's like it's considered one thing. One
in
value.
an answer, perhaps the very fact that that it would be an endless problem means that it doesn't matter which way you stack it, because it would always end up being the same result.
I mean, at what point do you just put it on a shelf, right?
Like like if you had to, if you did
It's too
had
problematic.
to, then it means it doesn't matter because you'd always be left with the same result.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, thank you. Okay, okay. Another point. There's a fascinating machloket between the Taz and the Magen Avraham about respecting the books. We understand the order. The order is really not that complicated. Some people, there are all sorts of interesting questions that have developed, but really, according in halakha, it's really quite simple. It's Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and then everything else. Okay, there's a very, very interesting question. Between the Taz asks a question. I don't know if you've ever seen this, but let's say I'm learning a book now, and I want to lean my book on a stender in order that it should be an angle to read it more clearly. But I haven't got a stender. Can I take another holy book and lean the book that I'm learning? Can I lean it on a book in order to study? Like, let's say this Chumash over there. I want to learn this Siddur. Can I open the Siddur, and then lean the Siddur on the Chumash in order to bench?
Taz says no.
Huh?
Taz says no.
Taz says no.
Taz says no.
Taz says no because it's a disrespectful use of the. It's a disrespectful use for the Chumash, right? However, the Magen Avraham argues. The Magen Avraham tells a story. It's a very, very interesting story. And based on that story, he wants to suggest otherwise. And this is his story. The Gemara Megillah tells us a story about, let's say you're in a, there is various halachot. If you're in a house, right? And there's a house next to, you have two apartments next to each other. So you have a room here, and there's a window, and there's another room, right? Now, if the window over here is big enough, and chas v'sholom someone passes away in the next door room, then the tumah can transfer from the room next door into this room. Now, if you have a Aron HaKodesh that happens to be the same size as this window, can you strategically place the Aron HaKodesh inside the window to block it in order that this room should be away, sort of separate from that room, such that if someone were to pass away in that room, the tumah would not transfer from that room into this room? And the question that the Magen Avraham was asked, would this be a disrespectful use of an Aron HaKodesh? Because really what I'm doing by putting this Aron HaKodesh in the window is I'm using the Aron HaKodesh to close up a window in order that the tumah shouldn't pass between the two rooms. Is that a disrespectful use for the Aron HaKodesh? And he says, Kivan she'ein mishtamesh bo klum, demali shemunach kan o kan. He said it's not a disrespectful use of the Aron HaKodesh because as far as the Aron HaKodesh is concerned, it doesn't matter where the Aron HaKodesh, assuming it's all on the right wall, it doesn't make a difference where it is. Since you're not planning on putting it there forever, therefore it is not an inappropriate use of the Aron HaKodesh. That's the ruling of the Magen Avraham. Based on that ruling, he then he then references what we saw in the Taz. He quotes the Taz, actually it does. ביורדי כתב, דאסור לקח ספר, או להניחו תחת ספר אחר כדי להקפיאו, שיהיה נוח לו לראות. לעיין בתוכו, אלא אם כן מונח הספר כבר, אז מותר להניח השני על גביו. He says, the Taz tells us you're not allowed to use book A to lean on book B, right? However, based on what we just saw in the story of this Aron HaKodesh in the window, ממה שכתב לאל משמע דשרי, וכל שכן כשעושה כן ללמוד ממנו. He says differently. According to the Magen Avraham, when I have a book and I'm leaning another book on that book, and the reason why I'm leaning book B on book A is in order that I can learn book B. Do you know what book A is saying? Book A is saying, yippee, what an honor it is for me, book A, to serve the Limud Torah through book B. You follow? And therefore, rules of Magen Avraham, you are allowed to use book B to lean on book A. Does that make sense?
Just as long as it's not in the order we were talking about earlier, that you wouldn't lean a Siddur on a Chumash.
Correct. Yes. Yes. I have to say, despite the Magen Avraham, the practice nowadays happens to be more like the Taz. I mean, it seems to me, in my experience, that even though the Magen Avraham seems to say that it is a respectful use, but I suppose people might see it and seem that it's like you're using a sefer disrespectfully, and even though the book might be saying yippee, since other people might be thinking it's a disrespectful use of the book, it seems to me that more people follow the Taz than the Magen Avraham and do not lean book A on book B. Yes. What were you going to say? Hirsch, did you have a question?
So it's like an issue of Mark Ayin.
I don't know, maybe just like a lack of respect. Yeah. Let's say. Okay. That's the end of part 1. Is everything clear to everybody? Joy? Happiness? Joy? Really? Oh, how lovely. Okay. Let's move on to the third topic. The third topic is when are you allowed to erase God's name?
Never. Correct.
So this is learned from a very interesting pasuk in Sefer Devarim. When we are just about to enter the land of Eretz Yisrael, we're about to enter the land of Israel, the Torah tells us that we are required to get rid of, destroy all Avodah Zarah that exists in Eretz Yisrael before we enter the Holy Land. Right?
Wow, so what we're taking this is the direct opposite. That's something that's got Hashem's name, which is
correct. The Torah itself says that. Let me read you the verse. The verse says like this: V'nitaztem et mizbechotam. You should shatter their altars. V'shibartem et matzevotam, and break their monuments. V'asherehem tisrun v'esh, and burn their trees. U'v'silei Elohem, and their idols together you should destroy. V'badetem et shemam min ha'makom ha'hu, you should erase their names from that place, meaning from the land of Israel. And then the Torah says afterwards, Lo ta'asun kain l'Hashem Elokechem. Don't do any of this to God. So we're commanded to destroy all these, idol worshipping items, and then we're told, however, for Hashem, don't do any of this stuff.
So you get 2 mitzvahs in one. You get taseh v'lo taseh.
How's that?
It's saying taseh, destroy those, and then
right.
this to Hashem, lo taseh.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, he's saying destroy. He's certainly saying destroy ours. Destroy theirs, I'm sorry. Any of their stuff, get rid of that. Absolutely. And the Rambam in the next source, Kol ha'ma'abed shem min hash'ah. Okay, so the Rambam then explains what is it they were not allowed to do for God, and he says the truth is two statements in the Rambam. The first one is, when it says you're not allowed to destroy God's name, he means literally God's name. Kol ha'ma'abed, anyone who destroys, echad shem min hashemot hakadoshim, one of the holy names of God, shenikra Bahem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Hu lokem min HaTorah. You're not allowed to destroy a name of God. So if ever you see a name of God, you're not allowed to erase it. Sharei hu omer ba'avodat kochavim v'ibadatem et shemam. You have to destroy their names, and then we're told don't destroy God's name. You follow? And then he lists the 7 names of God. Do you see that? Hashem HaNichbad, Yud Kei Vav Kei, Hu Hashem HaMeforash, or Anichtav Hashem. Do you see all this? They've got a list of all of God's names, or any of these, and there are 7 names here. These are the 7 names of God that we're not allowed to destroy. Do you see that?
Got a question, but I feel like it's already answered by the way you've written basically all of the papers. Is that if it's abbreviated or if it's mostly written out in God's name, is it considered that you can't destroy it now?
Say that again.
It's clearly written in a way that you're reading Hashem's name. However, it's a little off, therefore not being fully complete. Like for example, most people know that when you write hey with a little apostrophe, we know that's referencing Hashem's name. Or if we write Yud Kei Vav Kei, as it's been written here on your first page. So it's clearly Hashem's name, but it's 2 letters have been replaced.
Yeah, so the truth is, on that issue, there's actually a very interesting discussion. But I'm afraid to say... second piece down, he writes it as Yud Kuf Vav Kuf. So there are 2 things. Yossi, your question is excellent. The truth is there are 2 things. One thing is, obviously, if it's God's name, you're not allowed to erase it. That doesn't even need to be discussed. What about an abbreviation? So the Achiezer talks about this. He talks about any symbol for God. The question is, if I write God in English, G-O-D, are you allowed to rub out G-O-D?
No.
And on that question, is G-T any different to G-O-D?
Because it's specifically admitting the name. Now there is more nuance to it. If you're talking about like gods in like an anthropological sense, like talking about deities, no, it's fine to erase it. But if you mean God, if you're talking about Hashem, it's a sword to erase if you wrote the O.
But Hirsch, that expands then, because once you translate it over to English and it's fine, it means you can translate it as long as the meaning is there.
Yeah, it's about intent. What is the purpose of you writing that? If you're talking about
So
Hashem,
if you're saying it's intent, then your answer is yes, you cannot destroy anything with the intent of it meaning God.
Yeah.
Oh, so the truth is, that is a debate. Achiezer speaks about that over here. And according to that, any symbol written in any language that is referring to God is a problem. You're right.
Right.
So there is a
when he
debate
said
about that.
G-D, which is people trying to avoid, but everyone knows and the intent is there.
Well, that's the point.
According
That's the point
to
of having
you,
the dash. So
even that you can't destroy.
No. I'm referring to, let's say, Goddeses. If you're talking about some like random cultures, deities versus Hashem, and that's the distinction I'm trying to make. If you have a capital G with a lowercase o lowercase d versus the dash, the whole point of the dash is it can be
it can be derived from you. The last thing you
specifically
said
talking about
with
that,
the ESS.
That was something very specific.
But-
Very specific. I wasn't done yet.
I'm not arguing over you.
I wasn't done yet. I wasn't done yet. I'm talking specifically about the word God,
From what
not
you
anything else.
said, that one's fine to erase from what you said. The ESS at the end, you know.
Because we're talking, let's say,
That's fine
Rash
because
to
they're
whatever
intending for avoid zara. That's clear. However, the G-D is very clear. It's intended.
yeah, but it's
for
with the
God.
dash. That's the point. It's
The-
fine to erase.
But the dash itself has that
The name
that
is
Hey,
tiny
Hirsch-
word has become a symbol.
Hirsch
Why do
and
you say
Yossi?
Elohim? Why do we
Of
write
meaning
Elohim?
Hirsch and I just want to say one thing. Beseda?
I could just do this. I could do. Where is it?
You're allowed
This.
to write something.
Not disrespectful because that's not. The name.
Okay, I just want to say 2 things. There are 2 issues in the. There are 3 things I'd like to do before today. The first one is we explained if you were to write God's name, and for that there's really nothing to talk about. As somebody wrote, as the Rambam mentions, there are 7 names of God. If anyone writes out in full any of those 7 names of God, you can't destroy them, and that word, if it was written, needs to go into a geniza. I'll just mention in brackets, and this goes back to our discussion of earlier, if this name of God was written by somebody who does not believe in God, then you're allowed to throw it away. So, for example,
the intention matters
yeah,
most, is what you're saying.
absolutely. For example, we had if there's a Bible, I mean, the example we used to have in England is if there was a Bible published by missionaries, you're allowed to burn it, even though it contains God's name, all of the names over here, many, many times. You'd be allowed to destroy it because it's not
But in
only,
Hebrew?
yes. Why? Because it's not only the formation of those 4 letters, but there's something about intent. Now, I'm not sure if I need to have intent for God in order for it to be valuable, but when it's clearly that it wasn't intended as God's name, you can destroy it. So, the first category is if it was written by a believer in Hashem, wrote one of the 7 names of God, that piece of paper, irrespective of where it appears, would need Geniza. That's number 1. Category number 1. Is that clear? Category number 2 is where I'm not writing one of these 7 names, but I'm writing Hashem, an H with a dash, or I'm writing G-O-D, or writing G-D. Concerning that, there is quite a big debate. Because if we're saying that I'm writing I'm writing a word that is referencing God, even though I'm not using one of God's names, then according to some, there is no difference between a G-O-D or a G-D, because both of those formulations are a reference to God, and therefore both of them would need a Geniza. You follow? However, there are others who say no. It's only if you write God's name in Hebrew that would need a Geniza. Anything else doesn't bring down the holiness of God, and therefore may not need
that makes more
Geniza.
sense to me. I'll tell you why. Because things translated into English is translated through the best of efforts, right? Which means that when you assign to it only the importance of intention, it means pretty much anything can become a symbol as long as it's close enough related. So if I want using G-D because I specifically don't want to use G-D, but I still want to reference God, I will say the Almighty. And there's only one. You can't get confused when you write the Almighty.
Right.
So therefore, the Almighty,
Especially with the
based on
capital.
what we've just discussed, now becomes the new G-D and can.
Right, quite right. That's we're not going to read it now because we're running out of time. That's Achiezer, which is in the 4th section over here. But I want to just conclude that we said we were going to read 2 parts in the Rambam. We read number 1. I want to explain something, part number 2, and it even links a little bit to our quite lively discussion right at the beginning about holy books. The who?
Ramchal.
I'm not sure. Okay, listen to this over here. The Rambam writes over here. The Rambam, Yesodei HaTorah, writes Kitvei HaKodesh, holy writings. This is not a name of God. This is just not just, but this is a holy book rather than a name of God. Notice, remember in the verse, because the Pasuk said you have to destroy v'ibadatem et shemam, destroy their names, and then lo tasun kein Hashem Elokechem, do not destroy God's name. Here we're not talking about God's name, we're talking about holy writings. Kitvei Kodesh, Kulan, all of them, Ufei Rushehen, and their interpretation, Uviurehim, and their explanations. Asur l'sorfam, you're not allowed to destroy it, or la'abdam biyad, actively destroy them. V'hama abdan bayad, makinoto makat mardut. He's punished. Makat mardut is a punishment given by someone by a beit din, but it's not something that is biblically forbidden. Bamed or Mamurim, when do we say this is required? Bekitvei HaKodesh, shekitavam Yisrael b'kedusha. That if it was written by a Jew in holiness, aval apikores, a heretic, shekatav Sefer Torah, oh, look at that, a heretic who writes a Sefer Torah, sorfinoto, you can burn it. Im ha'azkarot shepo, even with God's name. Why? Mipnei she'ino ma'amin b'kedushat Hashem. He doesn't believe in the holiness of God's name. V'lo katvo lishmon, he wasn't writing that name intending as God. Ela shu ma'aleh b'da'ato shezeh kashar hadvarim v'hol v'da'ato ken lo nitkadash Hashem. The name of God did not become holy because when he wrote that word, he did not intend it as God. Mitzvah l'sorfa, and therefore this writing by the heretic should be destroyed. Kadei shelo laniach shem lapikorosim v'lo l'maasem. Aval oved kochavim shekatav et Hashem gonzim oto v'chen kitvei hakodesh shepalu o shektavam oved kochavim ignozu. However, if something was written by oved kochavim, who writes God, he's not an apikores, but he is oved kochavim, that is not burnt, that is put in a geniza. V'chein kitvei hakodesh shabalu, and also let's say a holy book that got worn out. The holy book that got worn out gets put into a geniza rather than destroyed. We see that there are two categories of writings that would go into a geniza. One type is anything that was written by someone who believes in God. If they wrote God's name, any appearance of God's name would need to go into a geniza. That's the first category. The second category is any holy book. A holy book is also something that would go into geniza. If there's a book that's falling apart, even if this holy book in English doesn't contain God's name once, doesn't contain any verses, since it is written as a Torah book, therefore once it's worn out, it would go into geniza. Now, I just want to make one more point, and this is a final point for today. There is a lovely book called Pnine Halacha, written by a chap called Rav Melamed. In fact, I think he might be behind here, over here. There's quite a few of them over here. So he says a lovely distinction. There are many rabbis who were asked about, nowadays, there are far more sort of holy writings than there were generations earlier. Certainly since the printing press, but even since more recently with photocopying. What's the din of a source sheet? What's the din of a newspaper with a Torah article in it? What's which things require geniza and which things don't? And the question was asked to Rav Moshe Feinstein, and he came to a conclusion that there's a distinction between a book and a newspaper or other things. What makes a holy book holy isn't just the text, but is also the intent. As we saw, if a heretic wrote it, then we don't maintain, then it doesn't maintain its holiness. The intent of the author and the reverence with which the owner treats this book, almost like the Torah that is saturated into the pages of the book are what warrant a geniza. But if, let's say, there's a newspaper, and like on page 25 of the newspaper there's a Dvar Torah, but everybody knows it's not Torah study to read this Dvar Torah. This is just like a cute idea that they put into a newspaper, but it was never intended for anyone to keep this newspaper for more than a week. So the newspaper, even though it contains Torah content, assuming it doesn't contain God's name in it, if it contains, then it would require geniza. But assuming it doesn't contain God's name in it, then the newspaper could be thrown away. But you can have the same Dvar Torah printed in a book, and that would require geniza. That would require geniza, because it's not just about the words themselves. There's also an aspect of permanence in a book, that this was written as a book to be studied, as opposed to a source sheet or something that was written short term. Just one more tiny point. Rav Moshe Feinstein reached this conclusion as well, similar to Pnei Halacha, but he added at the end of his responsum that he was reluctant to rule in this way, and it was his grandson or great-grandson that asked him the question, and he suggested that he ask others to be careful about it. My experience is that people are probably slightly more cautious than they need to be. I think that people are wary about throwing away God's name. It doesn't hurt to stick it in a geniza, and therefore we find, I think, people probably put more stuff away in a geniza than needs to be. But it would seem from the sources that it's really a book. If there's a book, a Torah book, then that needs to be in geniza, or any appearance of God's name. But if it's not a Torah book, or it doesn't contain God's name, then it's not a long-term Torah document. You understand? If it's a one-use Torah document and it doesn't contain God's name, then it would not need geniza. Yes.
No, I've been unfair on you so far. So I was like, maybe this is another question that's being unfair. But like,
oh, good. We like unfair questions. It's not. It's such a challenge. After you add so much.
No, I'm just joking. in the Cairo Geniza, they literally had shopping lists and love letters and anything written in.
I know. You're right. You're so right. That's an excellent question.
There was a different like halacha for those type of situations where they just put anything written in Hebrew would go in the Geniza.
Yeah, it could be there was much less writing then.
Right.
I think it could be that there was sort of weird. Yeah.
More of a different perception.
I think so. I think that this was nowadays every single week, people are churning off huge amounts of let's say there's this huge newspaper and there's one page Devar Torah in it. Yeah. Even like now, I think that there's far more like Torah material being produced on a daily basis, perhaps because of photocopiers and printing.
So is there a definitive suck on this? Can we put a newspaper out?
So the truth is, even though it would seem from the sources that it's either a Torah like book, like an article of Torah value, which I'm saying is a book, would require Geniza or God's name. Certainly, the way people treat holy writings is probably stricter than that. So even though you have Rav Moshe Feinstein, who said, really, I think you could probably recycle a lot of these pieces of paper, but check with other people. He didn't say, that's what I think.
If that's what he said, there's no real context there. I mean, that's a reason to be machmir in itself.
Correct. But then subsequently, Rav Melamed was much more lenient. And he said, really, when it comes to Sedra sheets and the like, there's no need to put them in a Geniza. But Tachlis, I see, when I go to shuls and look at the Genizas are normally full of Sedra sheets and source sheets, indicating that the people tend to be stricter. Yes.
No. I'm going to ask this in a way that if it's one answer, then it eliminates the rest of my questions.
Oh, good. Let's hope it's that. We need to go in a minute.
An empty
That's so
to
rude.
Box, do you have to empty a Kenisa?
Ah, that's another question. That's an excellent question.
It's an article of prayer and the Shema, and it's required in the
That's
Torah.
a very, very, very good question. The truth is that's discussed in the Gemara Megillah. There are different types of holy articles. There's something called Tashmishe Kedusha and Tashmishe Mitzvah. Are you familiar with Tashmishe Kedusha and Tashmishe Mitzvah? Tashmishe Mitzvah, things like tzitzit. There's nothing...
my next question was coming towards
So tzitzit, there's no holiness in tzitzit. Tzitzit, there's nothing holy. I perform a mitzvah with tzitzit or arba minim. There are things you perform. Those are Tashmishe Mitzvah. You have Tashmishe Kedusha, that's like tefillin, because they hold a holy text. In general, something which is Tashmishe Mitzvah does not require Geniza, but Tashmishe Kedusha does require Geniza. But even on Tashmishe Mitzvah, people are cautious. When your tzitzit are going, a lot of people cut them off if they have to change their tzitzit. They keep the tzitzit and use them as a bookmark afterwards, even though it's Tashmishe Mitzvah, and therefore you can throw it out, but the minhag is not to do that. I suppose because they're absorbing holiness and people don't like to throw it out. People, thank you for such an engaging and interesting discussion. An honor to learn with all of you. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening. Yishar Koach.